Hello, thank you so much for being here. If you're standing at the back, come on forward. There's definitely spaces in the front row. It makes us feel a little bit cozier if we have people closer, so come on down. My name is Anisah Osman Britton. I am a startup life reporter at Sifted. I also write about sex in the South Asian diaspora with something called Brown Bodies, and I have focused my entire career on DEI, especially when it comes to technology workforces and investment. And I'd love to introduce you to my wonderful fireside chat. Actually, I'll let you introduce yourself. That sounds much more fun.
Oh, does it? Oh, well, yeah. Kehinde Andrews, Professor of Black Studies. Also, we have a website, Make It Plain, and we do a lot of activist stuff as well.
And you've written a book.
I have.
Tell us a little bit about the book before we kick off.
The Psychosis of Whiteness, which is all about essentially saying that the way we think about race is entirely deluded, distorted, and we need to have a completely different way of thinking about race, white supremacy, etc., etc.
So this word psychosis has obviously kind of followed you around a little bit. It's quite provocative. Tell me why you chose that as the title and why it's something you think is relevant to the conversation around race.
Yeah, so firstly, I'd say I'm not a shock jock. I don't work for GB News. I have an actual job, right? So when this term psychosis is used because it's the only metaphor to think about white supremacy, how we think about whiteness. And whiteness is a set of ideas, how we think about the world, how we think about inequality, etc. And it is so deluded, so distorted. There is no other thing to talk about other than a psychosis.
So obviously this idea of whiteness is something that people struggle with. I know you've had these conversations before. What are we actually saying? We're saying that white people are racist? Are we saying it's the structural whiteness? What does that mean to you?
So really importantly, whiteness and white people are two different things. Whiteness is a set of ideas, and actually most of the book probably talks about black and brown people who are equally caught up in the psychosis of whiteness. So it's not really about saying white people are crazy, although there are some crazy white people, don't get me wrong, but there are some crazy black people too, right? So, but it really is about a set of ideas. How do you understand the world? And that's what's so wrong.
So we actually come from a very diverse sort of group of people here. We've got people from across the international spectrum in the tech scene. And race and whiteness and the proximity to it really differs from place to place. Someone said to me before we came up here, like, are you going to discuss colorism within communities, black people and brown people? Is that something you consider when you discuss whiteness?
Yeah, so if you think about whiteness, and this is one of the, so when I live in the UK and my family's Caribbean, and oftentimes you think about racism, the idea is if you're a minority, you'll feel racism, but if you're in like Nigeria, or if you're in India, because there's not that many white people, it's not racism. But where are the countries that have the biggest problem with skin bleaching? Nigeria, India, the places where there's actually not that many white people, because whiteness is still there. And you can see that in colorism. The lighter you are, the better, etc., etc. So these aren't just ideas for Britain, these are ideas that shape experiences across the world.
And what is that historical context that leads to that? Is it primarily colonialism? Is it the fact that we've exported a capitalist society from the West sort of to the global South? How is that whiteness has spread as the kind of pinnacle of success?
Yeah, so if you think about and it's actually relevant to a tech discussion because we're in a really technological age. The West is you can see all the stuff you can see around here, etc. But how did we get here? We got here for a system of colonialism, which is genocide, slavery, colonial rule, etc. This has created stark divisions in the world, and those divisions haven't gone anywhere, right? So the poorest part of the world today is so-called sub-Saharan Africa, which is where black people live. The richest part of the world is the West, where white people live, and there is a hierarchy in between, today as well as before. And so these ideas about the West or white people being supreme are necessary for everything we have today. Everything we see here right now is still based on white supremacy and that kind of oppression of black and brown people.
Just to contextualize that bit, because there's a definition there of like West versus East, but how do you feel about more of the definition of global North versus global South? Is that maybe more relevant when it comes to white versus sort of the rest of the world?
I mean, I think whether you say West or global North, I still say the West because this movement west from Europe to the Americas, where you have slavery, is the kind of defining feature of how you have where we have now. And what's happened in places like China and other parts of Asia have essentially joined the West. So even though they're not technically in the West, they're in the East still, they're actually following on the same principles of the West. So when we say West or global North, For me, I like West because gives you the history of it, I think.
Okay, so that's the historical context. Let's come to the present. Before we talk about maybe a wider spectrum, let's talk about tech. In the industry, we talk about race a lot when it comes to the fact that we have underrepresented founders, there's not enough investment, we don't hire, pipeline, everything we've all heard time and time again. For example, we know that black women get 2p on the pound in investment. So we're talking about this all the time, yet the needle barely seems to shift in the 12 years that I've been in the industry. What is it we're doing wrong? Are we not talking about it the right way?
So the problem, and this is what I tried to say in the book, is that the issue is actually about the structure, and the way that we've addressed race more generally is to think about can we bring along allies? Can we change the way people think? Can we change hearts and minds? This doesn't work. We have these ideas about white supremacy, white people being better, which, think about on a basic level, why are the top jobs dominated by white people? There is deep prejudices around who is intelligent, who is not intelligent, right? But where do those come from? Those come from this system that has black people at the bottom and white people at the top. And we've tried to kind of educate this out, but this isn't you can't do that. You have to it's a structural problem, so it needs structural solutions. And if you just try and do things so in the book has a whole chapter on diversity training and all these things, they don't work. They don't work at all. So we've basically taken the wrong approach. You can't teach out whiteness, and you can't make a moral argument to get rid of racism. It doesn't work. It doesn't work.
So I reckon about 20% of the people in this room, roughly, are working on DEI in some way, shape, or the other. Are we telling them, forget all of that, don't do it, it's not going to work?
Yeah, no, actually, no, I'm saying, no. So what I'm saying, you have to do it differently, right? So I just spend a lot of time. So I do a lot of time talking to companies. Some of those are tech companies, and they'll say, what do we need to do? I'll always say, drop the word ally straight away. Ally has one is kind of the white savior narrative. I need you to help me to hold my hand. One that suggests that this is a black and brown people problem. It's actually not. The people whose problem this is the mainstream, right? And then the second problem with that is things change when you put pressure on. So there's a critical race theory. Critical race theory has become a bad word. But critical race theory has a concept called interest convergence, which is you get change when the interests of minorities match the interests of the majority, not when you convince well-meaning white people. So, for example, we have the only black studies degree in Europe, and we don't have that because I convinced my bosses it was a good idea. We have that because I went to my bosses and said, we're the only people who can do it, you can make money, and we have black studies. That's how you get change, not through the other way.
So the conviction is the bottom line, not the humanitarian aspect.
Yeah, so diversity is a good idea. It makes you have better decisions, you have better company, you have less sick days if you're not being racist to your workforce, it's going to be more productive. Those are the kind of arguments you have to make, not this is a moral thing, that does not work. Right?
So I feel like I've seen often the conversation around this is good for the bottom line. We had the McKinsey report that came out however many years ago, and they update it, and it's always like diverse teams do better, they outperform homogenous teams. Yet that message still doesn't seem to be coming through because the next argument is pipeline. So if we're saying there's not enough people, then we're saying there's not enough talent, there's not enough investment. What is it there that's then going wrong if you have the business case for it?
So this is a key thing I do talk to companies about, is when you think about who is the best candidate, so much of that is racialized. If you're only recruiting from the top universities, you're straight away going to cut out so many people who can't get into the top universities. And we know this is racialized and classed, et cetera, et cetera. So actually, when you're thinking, I promise you, there are plenty of diverse people who could work in the industry. You have to go and find them. So a company can't say, look, we haven't got the pipeline. Make the pipeline. Go and get the people because they're there. And actually, the criteria we're basing success on is a deeply racist criteria. So companies can't hide behind that when they talk about pipeline.
I think that thing you mentioned there, a lot of people call it meritocracy, this idea of you look like Mark Zuckerberg, you studied at the same school as Mark Zuckerberg, you're going to be as brainy as Mark Zuckerberg. But no one wants to do that extra step, no one wants to do that extra bit of work, especially we're facing an economic downturn, we've had the crisis, we've had COVID. What is then the argument to be like, go to the extra university to get those people? Is it just bottom line again?
Unfortunately, because like I said, again, it's easy, right? Because there's easy ways to hire people. You're always going to have graduates from, if you're in America, it's MIT, Harvard, Cambridge. You're going to have, it's an easy way to do it. You can easily fill the places in doing that. But think about the tech that you're selling. Think about the world it's going into. Think about things like we just had a whole conversation about AI, which is deeply racist. Well, look, if you're going to sell to the world, you kind of need to have tech that matches the rest of the world. So if I was doing the AI work, I'd be making those arguments. Actually, the products are going to be better. The services are going to be better. You'll make more money from doing this because, again, the moral argument isn't going to do it.
Interesting. So I'm really curious about this idea of language and the specificity that we talk about. So we're saying let's not talk about allyship. And we were talking anecdotally that lots of people talk about race differently. For example, a lot of my Canadian friends will use the word coloured, whereas in the UK, the politically correct term would be people of colour. Is it a requirement that we all get onto this base level understanding of what race is and how we talk about it before we can even get to the let's solve it part of it?
Well, I think it's important so the reason I use the term psychosis is because there's so many completely irrational debates you can't even imagine. So, for instance, I've more than once been asked to talk publicly about can white people use the N-word? No. It's not really that complicated, right? But we have a whole conversation back and forth, different countries. It's just a no, right? Some things are just no. And I think we at least have to have a certain baseline of there are things which are acceptable and unacceptable, but it is quite difficult because you spend so much of your time having to fight through all these delusions, distorted excuses, et cetera, et cetera.
And diversity looks different from region to region, country to country. For example, we know in the UK we've got a massive South Asian population, whereas maybe in America, it's the Southeast Asian population that faces different racism. So how, again, do we get to this point of this is the baseline?
I think it's a simple baseline of, and we've had a lot of these discussions in the UK recently, who is it that gets to define what is offensive? So if you have whatever community says this is offensive, it's probably offensive, right? And hiding behind the idea of, oh, well, this is how we've done it, no, just listen to the people. And that's one of the things that tech has done, is it has made the views of minority groups much, much more prescient. So, for instance, in the UK, blackface, we had comedians who did blackface in the 21st century. It was offensive in 2003, but there was no Twitter. So you couldn't hear us complaining about it. But now we're complaining about it, and so now all the blackface has been taken off streaming services. That's a good thing. That is not censorship. It should never have happened in the first place. But we now have the opportunity to hear what people think and hear minorities' voices.
But some people say that's just identity politics and we are talking too loudly about the wrong things.
Which people would be my point. And again, this is the point. When we're defining what is offensive, what should be or shouldn't, how do you program AI, etc., you probably want to go to the people who are going to be offended, the people who are going to have to have that lived experience, right? And the real identity politics actually isn't black and brown people just saying, look, we find this offensive, please talk in different ways, please don't put boot polish on your face, that's deeply offensive. The real identity politics is pretending that everything's okay when it's really not.
Okay, so we've done the past, we're doing where we are right now. Let's kind of look forward a little bit. You mentioned AI, and you also mentioned in the past about geopolitical situations that have led to where we are now. So let's break those both down. The first one, AI. What are you seeing in this space that makes you go, uh-oh, we need to stop this right now, or we're going to end up in a very dangerous situation?
Well, I watch the Terminator movies.
Great films.
So, I mean, talk about building your own grave diggers. I mean, there's a wider existential question about AI, but I think also what you're seeing with AI is that the AI is being programmed, and you're seeing so much racism is being programmed into the AI, right? So this is why I say we have to have a different way of thinking, and yet this is the purpose of the book, and why I've used a term like psychosis, which I know is going to get people upset, but you should be like, when we're having conversations about race, they should be uncomfortable. And so much of the literature and the work that's come out now, particularly post-George Floyd, is trying to make you feel good. You end up with trying to feel better at the end of it. That's the very worst way to talk about racism. If we're going to have an honest conversation, it's a conversation where we all feel uncomfortable. And then hopefully then we can start to think in different ways. Because we have to really think in different ways. AI is just a reflection of our wider society. And the fact that it is flagging up all this racism shows us how much further we have to go, I think.
Is there a solution, though, when everyone who is building the products and everyone who is investing in the products is from a very specific demographic?
Well, this is why you need diversity, right? And I'm actually not usually an argument. We have the most diverse government in British history. It's also the most racist of my lifetime. So diversity doesn't always mean it is better, by the way. But if you have monoculture that's producing the technology, then it's going to be racist, right?
Let's touch on that point very quickly, actually, because you mentioned we in the UK have one of the most diverse governments from, I guess, an aesthetic perspective. But when we look at the intersectionality of what that looks like, how is that actually impacting our politics? Has it moved the needle? And maybe talking about that, let's touch a little bit on current state of affairs.
Well, yeah, if you think about, and this is, you mentioned the term identity politics previously. What's really happened actually in the UK and in the US over the last 20 years is there has been this emergence of right-wing identity politics, which is to essentially promote black and brown people who will say racist things, right? So we have in the UK, we literally we've had the last 4 Home Secretaries who do immigration policy, and in the UK, the immigration policy is the racist policy. Keep Britain white, keep us out. It's not a coincidence the last 4 Home Secretaries have been either Asian or black, and even Suella Braverman just resigned. They had to move the black guy from Foreign Secretary to Home Secretary because you have to have a black or brown person in that position because the policies are so overtly racist. Send asylum seekers to Rwanda, of all places, which has now been deemed illegal, thankfully. But this is a perfect example of you actually get away with being more racist because you have black and brown people. So Suella Braverman, for example, was saying there was an invasion of black and brown people. We should let people drown in the Mediterranean. That's identity politics, and it's become really, really quite poisonous in the UK. But it's really someone that's come over from the US, and I think it's one of the most dangerous features of where we are now because it's opened up the door to some really far right rhetoric, which has now become very, very mainstream.
I mean, Suella Braverman's replacement, his catchline is "keep the boats out," I believe was the poster sign.
Yep.
So incredibly racist. And I guess from that, the question is this. We are starting to see a lot more black and brown people and people of color in general moving up the ranks and becoming more successful. That success often looks like proximity to whiteness. We've just had a vote in the UK to call a ceasefire to Gaza, and in some of the most black and brown places that are represented by black and brown ministers, they have not called for a ceasefire or listened to their people due to the fear of losing their positions of power. What do we do in that situation, and how is that going to impact? Like you said, in the past we had genocide, we had colonialism. Where we are now, what does that look like going forward?
Well, I think it's fascinating. So, Jess Phillips, if anybody knows UK politics, Jess Phillips, Labour Party, actually resigned from her position. A white female politician resigned, said, look, this is we have to call for a ceasefire. Meanwhile, my MP, my neighbourhood, because of racial segregation, and I do talk about this a lot in the book, actually, about segregation in the UK, is about 75% black and brown. You see more Palestinian flags in my neighbourhood than you will see British flags in the coronation, all this stuff. If you're going to take a poll of my neighbourhood and the MP, 80% would say 80-90% ceasefire. But he abstained, and he's an Asian man, Khalid Mahmood, because there is this feeling that it's ironic, right? If you're black and brown, you can't say certain things. You can't they do the anti-racist thing because then you get heavily criticised. So that would be the definition of psychosis, that it has to be the white MPs, not the black and brown MPs, standing up for their constituencies because they don't feel that they can be anti-racist. Whereas you can have black and brown MPs on the Tory party being actually racist, right? And this is what I'm saying with psychosis. It makes no sense when you think about it rationally, but that is what white supremacy does.
You said heavily criticised. Who are they being heavily criticised by? If you say their constituents are calling for the same thing, who are they worried about being criticised by?
It's the thing with Labour is, interestingly enough, Labour generally, and this is why Keir Starmer has been so pro no ceasefire, etc., feels like it has to have credibility, right? And the black and brown politicians in Labour, if they want to be top, feel like they have to have credibility. So someone like Dawn Butler, for example, who very clear, very open, she can't be in the shadow cabinet because she's too much, right? So you have to have people who kind of toe the line, who are acceptable, right? But on the other hand, on the Tory party, you can have black and brown people who are complete extremists. So it creates this totally irrational space for politicians.
Right. We've done lots of negative spiraling, and I know this is not so negative spiraling, but we are in a very dark situation, both in tech and geopolitically. But I do want us to end on very practical things that people can do moving forward. For those who are maybe founders, C-suite, investors, what are 1 or 2 things that they can practically do in the next 1 to 3 months that would move the needle when it comes to bringing an anti-racist policy to work?
Well, there's a lot of things, and one of the first one is you really have to think differently. And I think this is really important. And this is why I wrote the book, so I can say, look, one thing, buy my book, right? Like, but obviously, the book.
You can say that.
Yeah, but it's because I was actually I'm writing a book about Malcolm X now, and I was reading some speeches last night, and he said one of the biggest mistakes we've made is trying to organize a people who are asleep. And he's talking about black people and black politics. But more generally, this is kind of what we've done with mainstream, with big corporations. We've tried to say, you should do these things, but we haven't woken them up, right? So the first thing we need to do, first thing anybody needs to do, is to really have a good dose of cold water, understand just how bad society is, right? So the last book I wrote, New Age of Empire, and this book, Psychosis and Whiteness, one of the questions I get at the end is, oh, it's really bleak. And I'm like, yeah, it's really bleak. What do you want? I can't end it with it's great, because it's not great. And actually having that recognition is the very, 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 very first thing. Then, hopefully, that then leads to say, well, we have to do things radically differently. We have to change. And, I mean, obviously, if you're a tech company, you're not going to start the revolution. But there are things you can do. As I said about pipeline, change your hiring practices. So there's a podcast by Malcolm Gladwell called Revisionist History. Deeply problematic politically, but has some good ideas sometimes. And one of the ideas he has is it should be illegal for anybody to put the name of their university on their CV. So it just says, I got a degree in this. Hire like that, you'll hire better people. Stop going to the top universities don't give the best education. Believe me, I work in universities. You'll find a better pool of people if you just invert how you're attracting people. Also, think about promotions. One of the things about promotions, there are people within your company who need to be promoted. Just promote them. What's the excuse? Like, I go to all these companies and they say, well, look, we're going to mentor people to apply better. It's not their fault they're not being promoted. It's your fault. Just promote them, right?
Is that quotas? Do we believe in quotas?
I think it's not necessarily quotas. It's just about, I would strongly recommend, have a review of people and actually make an effort. Can we promote people? Because it's not just about diversity on the ground level, it's at the top. I'm one of 160 black professors in the entirety of the UK. There's so few of us, we can't all get on a plane together in case it crashes and we're all dead, right? That's how bad it is. So no excuses. And then the third thing would be, think about, there's also corporate responsibility, right? And particularly in tech, where so much of this tech and the resources are taken from Africa for essentially nothing. You have a responsibility beyond just internally. You have a responsibility to communities and the world much more broadly.
Kehinde, thank you so much for your time. It's been so great to chat.
Yes, thank you. And thank you all.
Thank you.